The job listing had no company name. That was the first thing Lena Vasquez noticed, sitting cross-legged on her studio apartment floor at 11:47 at night, with her laptop balanced on her knees and every light in the place turned on. She'd stopped turning lights off 3 weeks ago, when she'd come home to find her window unlocked from the outside. The police had been polite and unhelpful. Her landlord had been sympathetic and equally unhelpful. Her sister had said, "Come stay with me in Portland," and Lena had said, "I'm fine," which was the thing she always said, and which had never been less true. She was not fine. She was a 28-year-old graphic designer with a good eye and a methodical mind and a stalker she couldn't prove existed in any way the law currently recognized. And she was sitting on her floor at midnight, reading job listings, not because she needed a job, she had one freelance. Enough, but because she needed a reason to not be here. A reason that came with a building and a badge, and a legitimate address where she was supposed to be during the day. Something she could point to if she needed to explain her movements. Something that created a paper trail of ordinary life to set against the creeping extraordinary wrongness of the last 4 months. Marcus Webb had seemed ordinary at first. That was the thing about him. He was her neighbor, 2 floors up, a software developer who'd introduced himself in the elevator with an easy smile and an offer to help with her recycling. She'd thought nothing of it. He'd knocked on her door a week later with a bottle of wine because he'd noticed her light was on and thought she might want company. She'd thanked him and said she was working. He'd left without incident. The incidents had started small. Her name in his mouth when she passed him in the lobby. Too familiar. Too certain. As though they'd already agreed on something she didn't remember agreeing to. Texts from a number she didn't recognize that knew specific things about her day. A coffee left outside her door one morning, with a note that said, "I saw you leave early. You looked tired." She'd gone to the building manager, who'd spoken to Marcus, who'd been reasonable and apologetic, and had continued anyway, more carefully. Then, the window. Then, 3 weeks of sleeping with the lights on. The job listing had been buried 17 pages deep in a search she'd started without particular hope. Executive assistant, it said. Immediate placement. Competitive salary. Full benefits. On-site position. City center. Below that, a single line of requirements: excellent organizational skills, discretion, ability to work unconventional hours, and an email address for applications. No company name. No address beyond city center. No job title for the person being assisted. It should have disqualified it immediately. Instead, Lena stared at it for a long moment, thinking about the blank week ahead of her, about Marcus Webb in the elevator that morning, who'd looked at her with an expression she couldn't report, because it was just a look. And she opened a new email and attached her CV and wrote 3 sentences that were entirely true. I am organized. I am discreet. I am available immediately, and sent it before she could think better of it. She expected nothing. At 6:17 the following morning her phone rang with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was a woman, brisk and efficient, with an accent that placed her somewhere Northern European. "Ms. Vasquez, we received your application. Can you come in today for an interview?" It was not phrased as a question. Lena said yes before she'd fully processed the asking. She spent the morning preparing with the thoroughness she brought to everything, researched the email domain, which returned nothing, searched the phone number, which returned nothing, told her sister via text that she had an interview at 11 at City Center, and sent her a screenshot of the listing. Her sister replied with 3 question marks, and then good luck. Lena put on the dark blazer she wore when she needed to feel assembled, and took the subway downtown, and followed the address the woman had texted her to, a building she knew by sight, but had never had reason to enter. It was not an ordinary building. It occupied half a city block in the old financial district, stone facade, 12 stories, with the particular gravity of something built when buildings were meant to make a statement about permanence. The lobby, when she pushed through the heavy glass doors, was all dark marble and brass, and the specific hush of spaces that had been designed to communicate that things of consequence happened here. A reception desk staffed by a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back severely looked up as Lena entered. "Vasquez," Lena said. "I have an 11 o'clock. The woman studied her with an expression Lena couldn't read. She'd seen that expression before and couldn't remember where. "Yes," the woman said. "He's expecting you." She stood, came around the desk. "I'll take you up." The elevator was old, brass-fitted, slower than contemporary elevators, and more deliberate in its ascent. The silver-haired woman stood beside Lena without speaking, which Lena would normally have found uncomfortable and instead found almost restful. She was a person who said exactly what she meant, and nothing more. That quality was rarer than it should have been. The 12th floor was a single corridor with a single door at its end. The woman stopped outside it. "There are no conditions on this interview beyond honesty," she said. "He values honesty above most other things." She paused, and something in her expression shifted by a fraction. "And Miss Vasquez, you were right to come here." Before Lena could ask what that meant, the woman had turned and walked back toward the elevator. Lena stood in the corridor for a moment. Looked at the door. She thought about Marcus Webb, and her unlocked window, and the coffee note, and the long nights with every light blazing. She thought about the fact that she'd applied to a job with no company name at midnight, out of desperation. She thought about the silver-haired woman saying you were right to come here with an expression like someone delivering a message that was also a key. She knocked on the door. "Come in," said a voice on the other side. She opened it. The office was not what she expected. She'd built something in her head on the elevator ride contemporary. Glass and steel. The visual language of modern corporate power. What she walked into instead was a room that seemed to exist slightly outside the building it occupied, as though the 12th floor had been quietly replaced with something from an earlier century. Dark wood paneling, bookshelves, a desk the size of a dining table, old and heavy and bearing the particular patina of something that had been used by someone for a very long time. The windows were tall and arched and looked out over the city, but the city outside seemed incidental to the room, like a painting hung in a space that had more important things going on inside it. And behind the desk, a man. He was looking at something on the desk when she entered, and he looked up as the door opened, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because Lena had stopped being capable of producing organized language. She had expected, without particularly examining the expectation, a businessman. Someone in his 40s or 50s, silver-haired perhaps, successful in the legible way that successful people often were. Instead, the man behind the desk looked no older than 35, dark-haired, with a face that was the kind of striking that took you a moment to process, because it exceeded the category of merely handsome so completely that you needed to recalibrate. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a mouth that was set in a neutral line that nonetheless communicated precision. His hair was dark and worn slightly longer than convention. Not unkempt, nothing about him was unkempt, but deliberate. His eyes were dark and still, and currently focused on her with an attention so complete it was almost a physical thing, like a change in air pressure. He stood. He was taller than the desk had implied. He wore a dark suit with the ease of someone who'd been wearing them for decades and had long since stopped noticing. "Miss Vasquez," he said. "Please sit down." His voice was low and unhurried and carried an accent she couldn't immediately locate, something that had moved through many countries over a long time. She sat. He sat. He looked at her across the desk with that complete attention for a moment before he picked up what she recognized as her CV, printed on paper, which meant someone had printed it very early this morning. "You have no company name on the listing," she said. She hadn't planned to open with that. It came out because it was true, and she was tired of managing herself. His expression shifted slightly. Not displeasure, something closer to appreciation. "No," he said. "We find it produces more genuine applicants. People who are applying because the role itself interests them, rather than because the company name provides reassurance." "And what is the company name?" He set down her CV. "Corvus Holdings," he said. "We manage a range of investments and interests across several sectors. The specifics are extensive and largely confidential. What would I be doing?" His eyes were still very focused on her. Precisely what the listing said. Organization, discretion, unconventional hours. "I have a complex schedule and considerable correspondence, and a number of matters that require someone capable of managing detail without needing everything explained twice. Why is the position immediately available?" "The previous assistant," he said, "had to be relocated for personal reasons." That was a careful sentence. She filed it. "What are the unconventional hours?" "I work primarily in the evenings and at night," he said. "I'm in the office most consistently between 4 p.m. and 2 a.m. If that schedule is incompatible with your life, this isn't the right position." Lena looked at him. He was watching her process this the way someone watched a mechanism they were curious about. "Why nights?" she asked. "A medical condition," he said. "That's the only explanation I'll offer." She nodded slowly. She thought about Marcus Webb, who was home during the day, who tracked her movements during daylight hours, who had never once to her knowledge been awake past 10 p.m. An evening and night schedule was the schedule that put her in this building during exactly the hours when she was most afraid to be in her apartment. She thought about the silver-haired woman saying, "You were right to come here." "What are you actually looking for?" she asked. Not the job description, the actual quality. He was quiet for a moment. His expression did something subtle, not quite surprise, but the adjacent thing. The slight recalibration of someone who'd asked this question of many people and received a different kind of answer every time. "Someone who doesn't need managing," he said. "Someone who sees what needs doing and does it without requiring the initiative to be provided. Someone who is honest even when honesty is inconvenient." He looked at her directly. "And someone who can be trusted with information that is sensitive in ways that go beyond ordinary professional confidence." "What kind of sensitive?" He folded his hands on the desk. "The kind that would be difficult to explain to most people, and which I would need to know you could hold without it affecting your function." She looked at him steadily across the heavy desk. He looked back at her with those dark, still eyes. "I'm going to tell you something honest," she said. "Not because it's relevant to the job necessarily, but because you said you valued honesty, and because I think you should know why I'm here." He waited. "I didn't apply for this job because it was the right career move." She kept her voice level. "I applied because I'm being stalked, and I needed a legitimate reason to be somewhere that wasn't my apartment. A building with security, hours that didn't match the pattern he's established." She looked at him. "I am genuinely organized and discreet and capable of unconventional hours. Everything on my CV is accurate. But I want you to know the actual reason I'm sitting here." The room was very quiet. The man behind the desk looked at her for a long moment with that complete attention, and she couldn't read what was behind it except that it was not skepticism and it was not discomfort. "Then," he said, quietly, and with a certainty she couldn't account for, "You're not leaving this building tonight." She went still. "Not a threat," he said immediately, reading whatever her face had done. His voice was entirely even. "What I mean is that you will not leave tonight without a confirmed start date, a security briefing, and the direct number for our building's private security team." He held her gaze. "Whatever you're dealing with, you came to the right place. The position is yours, if you want it." Lena looked at him across the old desk in the impossible room on the 12th floor. She thought about 11:47 at night, and a job listing with no company name, and the quality of desperation that made you send applications into the dark without expectation. She thought about the way he'd said you came to the right place, with the same certainty the silver-haired woman had used, as though both of them knew something about her arrival that she didn't yet know about herself. "Yes," she said. "I want it." She started that same evening. The silver-haired woman who introduced herself properly as Mrs. Aldrin, in the tone of someone who had been introducing herself the same way for a very long time, gave her a tour of the 12th floor with the brisk efficiency of someone who never used two words when one would do. Office. Conference room. Secure filing room. Fingerprint access. She would be added to the system by end of day. Small kitchen. Stocked daily. Her desk, positioned outside the main office, solid wood, and bearing a computer that was both more powerful and somehow more elegantly designed than anything she'd used before. A direct phone line. A set of keys. "There is a car on standby from 7 p.m. onward," Mrs. Aldrin said, stopping at the kitchen to produce coffee, with the automatic ease of someone who anticipated needs before they were expressed. "It will take you where you need to go and bring you back. You won't be using public transport while you're working here." Lena accepted the coffee. "That's not I don't need that level of it's standard," Mrs. Aldrin said, in a tone that closed the topic. "Mr. Voss prefers the people in his employ to be safe. He's quite particular about it." "Mr. Voss," Lena said. That was the name then. She'd been given the surname only. In the brief paperwork Mrs. Aldrin had produced with her contract solid, legitimate, more generous than anything she'd have negotiated for herself. "Voss, A," the signature line said. "What's his first name?" Mrs. Aldrin glanced at her. "Alaric," she said. "Though I'd suggest waiting for him to offer that rather than using it." Lena nodded. She sat at her desk and looked at the computer and the stack of correspondence Mrs. Aldrin set beside it printed, in envelopes, some of them bearing postmarks from countries she'd have to look up. There were also 3 leather-bound journals containing what appeared to be a scheduling system she would need to decode, and a note in handwriting she didn't yet recognize that said, "Start with the correspondence. Priority items are marked. Thank you for being here." That last sentence. She read it twice. "Thank you for being here," as though her presence were a specific gift rather than a professional arrangement. She started with the correspondence. The work itself was not what she'd expected, not because it was difficult, but because it was interesting, in a way that generic executive assistant work rarely was. The correspondence came from what appeared to be legal firms in 4 countries, investment contacts in 2 more, and a handful of individuals who wrote in ways that suggested relationships of long standing. One letter was in French, one in what she eventually identified as Romanian. She flagged both with notes indicating translation would be required, and moved through the rest with the methodical pleasure she took in bringing order to complicated systems. At 6 p.m. the office door opened. He moved through his own space with the same quality of ease she'd noticed in the interview, not hurried, not performing, simply present in the room in a way that made the room different once he was in it. He stopped when he saw her at her desk, and something in his expression did the subtle thing she was already starting to recognize. "You stayed," he said. "You hired me," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. He looked at the organized desk, the flagged correspondence, the notes she'd left in a neat column beside the relevant items. "You work quickly," he said. "I like systems. Finding them, building them." She looked up at him. "The French and Romanian letters need translation. I can handle French, but my Romanian is limited." "I'll take the Romanian." He picked up her notes, read through them with the same focused attention he'd given her in the interview. "This is good," he said. "Thank you." He looked at her over the notes. "How are you doing?" Not about the work. The question was direct enough that she answered it honestly before she'd considered the alternative. I feel safer here than I have in weeks, she said. Which is strange because I've been here 6 hours, and I don't know anything about this place or you. What would you like to know? She thought about this. The question felt genuinely open, which was unusual. Most people who asked what do you want to know were offering a menu they'd already decided. He seemed to mean it as an actual invitation. What does Corvus Holdings actually do? She said. Not the official version. He set down her notes. Leaned against the edge of the corridor wall with his arms folded. Unhurried, we manage assets, he said, across many sectors and many years. Some of what we hold has been in the portfolio for a very long time. Property, certain business interests, collections. He looked at her steadily. The day-to-day function of the company is legitimate and documented. There are also aspects of my work that are harder to categorize. She looked back at him. Such as? He was quiet for a moment. Such as the fact that I've been running this company for considerably longer than the incorporation date would suggest. He held her gaze. Such as the fact that there are things about how I work and what I am that will become apparent over time, and that I'd rather you encounter gradually than have explained all at once. That's a careful way of saying something specific. She said. Yes, he agreed. I'm being careful because you've had a difficult few months, and I don't want to add to that difficulty unnecessarily. He looked at her directly. What I will tell you is that you are safe here. Not in a vague general sense. Specifically, concretely safe. This building has security measures that go beyond what's visible, and I have means of protecting the people in my employ that are also beyond the ordinary. Why would you do that for someone you hired 6 hours ago? Because you told me the truth in the interview, he said simply. When you didn't have to. That matters to me. He pushed off the wall, moved toward his office. Get some rest if you need it. There's a room on this floor if you'd rather not go home tonight. No obligation. It's simply available. She looked at his back as he crossed to the office door. Mr. Voss, she said. He turned. Thank you, she said, for all of this. He looked at her for a moment, with those dark, still eyes that she was already understanding contained more than they showed. Alaric, he said. And you don't need to thank me. He went into his office and closed the door behind him, and Lena sat at her desk in the warm light of the 12th floor corridor and felt something she hadn't felt in months settle over her like weight leaving rather than arriving. She didn't go home that night. Not because she was afraid exactly, or not only because of that, but because at 10 p.m. when she'd finished the correspondence and organized the schedule into something that made consecutive sense, she was still sitting at her desk, and the thought of the subway and the lobby and the elevator up to her floor, where Marcus Webb lived 2 above her, produced a tiredness so specific and so physical that she simply couldn't assemble herself toward it. She knocked on the office door. Come in, Alaric said, and she opened it to find him at the desk with the Romanian letter and a separate document in handwriting she didn't recognize, making notes in the margin of something in a script she thought might be the same older-seeming language she'd noticed in the correspondence. He looked up. The room you mentioned, she said. I think I'd like to use it tonight if that's still an offer. He set down his pen. Of course. He stood, came around the desk, led her back into the corridor, and past her own desk, and around a corner she hadn't noticed before, to a door that opened into a room that was small and high-ceilinged and contained a bed with proper linens and a window showing a slice of city light and a bathroom with towels folded in. The kind of precise stack that suggested Mrs. Aldrin had been here recently. There's a keypad on the door, he said. I'll have your code set up tonight. He looked at her. You can lock it from the inside. He said it without inflection. Just information. But she understood the information he was giving her. This room locks from the inside, and no one comes in without your permission, and that matters here. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Went to leave. stopped in the doorway. "The person who was bothering you," he said. "The neighbor. What do you know about him?" She looked at him. "Not much that can be proven. His name is Marcus Webb. He's lived in my building for 8 months. He works in software. He seems completely ordinary to everyone else." Alaric's expression was very still. "What does he look like?" She described him. Average height, sandy hair, pale eyes, always in gray or beige, that specific coloring of someone who'd chosen camouflage as aesthetic. Alaric listened with the focused stillness. She was accumulating experience of the quality of attention that was not passive, but active, filing everything it received with precision. He nodded when she finished. "All right," he said. "Sleep well." She did sleep, better than she had in weeks, in the locked room on the 12th floor, with the city light through the window and the sounds of the building around her. A different building than her own, with different rhythms and different weight. She woke at 7:30 to the sound of the city waking below, and lay in the unfamiliar room, and felt the careful quietness of being somewhere she felt safe. Mrs. Aldrin was at the reception desk when Lena came out, as though she hadn't gone anywhere. Coffee was already on the kitchen counter with a paper bag containing a pastry. Lena ate at her desk and started on the day's work, which had materialized in a neat stack beside her keyboard, and by 10 o'clock she'd reorganized the filing system for the secure room into something that was both logical and faster to navigate, which she suspected might be the most useful thing she'd done in years. Alaric arrived at 4. As he'd said she'd now seen him in the building at no point during daylight hours, and this registered, but she wasn't ready to examine it yet. He came through the main door with the long coat she'd started to associate with him and stopped at her desk before going to his own. "You were here all day," he said. "I worked," she said. "I hope that was all right." He looked at the reorganized filing list she'd left on his desk corner and the updated schedule and the responses she'd drafted to 3 correspondence items. He looked at it for a moment. "It's more than all right," he said. She looked up at him. He was closer than he usually stood, she noticed, and she noticed that she didn't mind. He was looking at the work with that particular quality of his, the genuine looking, not performed, the kind that saw what was actually there. "There are things I need to tell you," he said, "about what I am." He looked at her. "Not today, but soon. I want you to know that before they become apparent on their own." She looked at him steadily. "I'm already drawing conclusions," she said. "I know." He almost smiled. "You're very observant. You never come in during daylight. The office has no natural light. The security system has components I can't identify. The correspondence includes people who write as though they've known you for a very long time, and none of them seem to think that's unusual." He looked at her with those dark amber eyes. "How long?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Longer than the building," he said. "Longer than this city in its current form." She nodded slowly, processing this, placing it next to everything else she'd filed. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. His expression was careful. "Not to you," he said. "That's not an evasion. It's the most accurate answer I can give." She believed him. That itself was data. She'd spent 4 months around someone who'd felt wrong in a way she couldn't prove, and she'd learned to trust the specific register of that feeling. Alaric felt nothing like wrong. He felt like the opposite of wrong in a way that was distinct and clear as a compass finding north. "All right," she said. "Tell me when you're ready." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for not being frightened." "I've been frightened for 4 months," she said. "I've used up quite a lot of it on the wrong person." She met his eyes. "I don't think I have any left for you." The truth arrived on the 5th night. Not dramatically, not with thunder or revelation. It arrived the way most true things arrived in her experience, through accumulation, through the specific weight of enough evidence, finally becoming impossible to hold at an angle. She'd been at her desk at 11:30, Working through a set of contracts that required careful reading. The legal language was dense and archaic in places, whole phrases lifted from what looked like earlier centuries of legal practice. She'd been making notes when she heard a sound from the office she hadn't heard before, a sharp exhale, quickly controlled, followed by silence that was somehow different from his usual silence. She knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then, "Come in." He was at his desk but not working. He was very still in the way she now understood meant the opposite of calm stillness as containment rather than ease. There was a letter on the desk in front of him, and the quality of the room was wrong in the way rooms got wrong when something in them was under pressure. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked up. His face was controlled, but something had slipped slightly behind the control, and she recognized in it the particular exhaustion of someone managing something for a long time, without help. "There's a situation," he said. "It requires some decisions I've been deferring." He stopped, looked at her. "Sit down, Lena." She sat across from him. "I told you I would explain what I am when I was ready," he said. "I think waiting longer serves neither of us." "All right." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter without seeing it. "What I am is old," he said. "Not in the ordinary sense." He raised his eyes to hers. "I've been alive for 600 years. What that makes me, by the category your folklore has assigned to it, is a vampire." The room was very still. She looked at him. He looked back with those dark amber eyes, and she understood they were dark amber, because there was something lit in them that wasn't entirely human, something ancient and precise, and very carefully managed. She thought about the daylight absence, the accent that placed itself nowhere contemporary, the correspondence with people who'd known him for what seemed like decades and referenced events that predated the addresses they were writing from, the building security she couldn't identify, the specific quality of his stillness. She thought about the way he'd said you came to the right place, like someone who had been waiting for something and recognized its arrival. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "That's all?" "I've been building toward this conclusion for 5 days," she said. "You've just confirmed it. Most people require more time with the idea. I'm not most people." She held his gaze. "Is anything you've told me not true?" "No. The job is real. Completely real. The salary, the contract, the security arrangements, all real." He leaned forward slightly. "Lena, I want to be clear with you. I did not hire you because of what you are, or because of some supernatural design. I hired you because you sat across from me and told the truth when you didn't have to, and the work you've done in 5 days has been exceptional." He looked at her steadily. "What I am doesn't change any of that." "I know," she said. She looked at him properly, the way she'd been looking at him in pieces all week, the face, the hands, the particular way he moved through space. She let herself look at it all together. "How long have you been in this city?" "About 200 years in total," he said. "On and off." He looked at the window. "It changes around me. I've watched this part of the city built and demolished and rebuilt." He looked back at her. "It's a strange thing to describe to someone." "I imagine it is." She paused. "The letter upset you." He looked at the desk. "Yes, there are others like me. Not many, but some. There are politics, for lack of a better word. Arrangements of power that periodically require attention. This is one of those occasions." His expression was tired in a way that implied a tiredness unrelated to sleep. "It will require me to travel. To negotiate." He looked at her. "It would be helpful to have someone I trust accompanying me." She stared at him. "You've known me 5 days." "I know," he said. "And I recognize that's not a reasonable thing to ask." He held her gaze. "But I find I trust you considerably more than the duration of our acquaintance would normally justify." She thought about that. About the silver-haired woman in the elevator who'd said you were right to come here, about the way this building and this floor and this room had felt from the first moment like somewhere she could breathe. "Where would we go?" she asked. "Vienna first," he said. "Then, possibly Prague." She thought about Marcus Webb, about her apartment with its blazing lights, about 11:30 on a Tuesday in a building that felt safer than anywhere she'd been in months. "When?" she asked. "4 days," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him across the old desk in the old room. "Tell me what I'd need to know to be useful to you there," she said. The relief in his expression was subtle but real, the way his expressions always were, never performed, just present. He told her, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she was starting to understand, was one of the things he valued most about her, not because listening was unusual, but because this quality of it was. She listened the way she looked at things, getting beneath the surface to the structure, following the logic of what he was describing, and asking questions at exactly the right moments. By 2 a.m. she understood the shape of his world considerably better than she had at midnight. She wasn't afraid of it. That, she was starting to understand, might be the most important thing about her. Vienna was cold and old, and deeply beautiful in the way of cities that had decided centuries ago what they were, and had committed entirely to the decision. Lena stood at the window of the hotel suite, which was not a hotel, she'd quickly understood, but a property Alaric owned, the 3rd floor of a building in the 1st district that had been in his name in various forms since before the building around it was constructed, and watched the city organize itself into mourning with a cup of coffee, and the particular sensation of someone who had left one life and not, yet fully arrived in another. 4 days ago, she'd been sleeping on the 12th floor of a building in a city that had stopped feeling safe. Now she was in Vienna with a 600-year-old vampire who trusted her enough to bring her into the most sensitive political negotiations of his kind. The strangeness of it was real. She held it without flinching. Alaric was in the adjoining room, which he'd taken because the suite had 2, and because he'd been very careful across the entire duration of their acquaintance about the distance between them, which she noticed the way you noticed something precisely because it was deliberate. He was considerate in a way that was not performance the same quality as his honesty, just applied to proximity. He did not assume. He did not press. He gave her space with the ease of someone who understood exactly what space was worth. She appreciated it more than she knew how to say, coming from 4 months of someone who'd made space itself feel unsafe. The first meeting was that afternoon. He'd explained the structure of it the night before on the plane, not a commercial flight, another thing she was adjusting to with the thoroughness he brought to briefings, and she'd taken notes and asked the right questions, and come away understanding that what she was walking into was something like a diplomatic gathering between 5 very old, very powerful entities who'd maintained a territorial arrangement across Central Europe for several centuries and were currently in dispute about boundaries that had shifted. Her role was observer and recorder, and, if needed, Alaric had said, the person in the room who could be seen to represent ordinary human interests, because I have always maintained that those interests matter, he'd said, and having someone present who embodies them makes that argument harder to dismiss. She'd thought about that. About being brought to a gathering of ancient creatures as evidence of a philosophical position. It was the most unusual professional brief she'd ever received. She'd also found it oddly moving that his argument for the value of human life was presented by simply bringing a human who was there because she was trusted. The meeting took place in an apartment that looked like a museum had been repurposed as someone's living space. All high ceilings and oil paintings and furniture that Lena's trained eye placed comfortably in the 18th century. There were 4 others besides Alaric. A woman with silver hair who was introduced only as Mireille, and who looked at Lena with the deep assessment of someone reading a book she'd read many times before in other editions. 2 men who stood at opposite ends of the room and didn't speak to each other, and a 4th who sat at the center with the quality of someone accustomed to being the axis that rooms organized around. Lena sat quietly and watched, and took notes in the shorthand she'd developed over years, and read the room the way she read all rooms, looking for the structure beneath the surface, the actual relationships beneath the formal ones. What she observed was that Alaric was respected in a way that the others weren't quite respected by each other. There was a quality to the attention the room gave him that was different from the attention they gave the man in the center chair. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. The acknowledgement of someone who had seen more and survived more and had maintained, across all of it, a quality of judgment the others hadn't. He presented his position clearly and without performance, spoke about the arrangement they'd held, the reasons for certain boundaries, the specific problem that had arisen from one party's recent decisions. He was precise and fair, and when someone challenged him, he absorbed the challenge and responded to what was actually in it, rather than what was positioned around it. She watched him do this and understood something she'd been assembling since the first day. He was very good at this. Not because he was the most powerful, though he might have been, but because he was the most honest. And in a room full of very old creatures who had spent centuries managing each other, honest was the rarest and most powerful thing to be. They broke for an hour. Morale appeared at Lena's side with a cup of tea that Lena hadn't asked for, but wanted. "You're watching him," Morale said. "He's worth watching," Lena said. Morale looked at her with those deep-reading eyes. "Yes," she agreed. "For quite some time he has been." She paused. "You're not frightened?" "No, of any of this." "No," Morale seemed to consider her. "How long have you known him?" 9 days, Lena said. Morale looked at her for a moment. Then she said something that Lena would think about for a long time afterward. 9 days or 9 centuries, she said. Some things you recognize immediately. The second day in Vienna, she had 3 hours to herself, while Alaric managed a private meeting that didn't require her presence. She walked. This was what she did when she needed to think, not sitting still, not in a chair with a notebook, but moving through a place, letting her feet handle navigation while her mind handled whatever it actually needed to handle. She walked along the Ringstrasse in the November cold and looked at the architecture that Alaric had watched built, and she thought about her life in the specific way she'd been unable to think about it for 4 months. Clearly, without the constant interference of managing her own fear, she thought about Marcus Webb, who was in her city in her building 2 floors up, and who she'd been afraid of for 4 months. She thought about how fear had restructured everything: her sleep, her movements, her work, her sense of what was possible. She thought about how long it had taken her to realize that the reorganization was happening, because it happened incrementally, the way all encroachment happened, one small adjustment at a time until you couldn't remember what the original arrangement had looked like. She thought about the job listing at midnight, about the quality of desperation that had made her send that email. She thought about Alaric. This was the part that required more careful handling, not because it frightened her she'd established that it didn't, but because it was significant, and she was trying to be honest with herself about significant things rather than doing what she'd always done, which was file them away and wait to see if they became more manageable with age. She'd known him 9 days. 9 days was not long enough for what she felt, by any conventional measure. But she was 38 days removed from sitting on her floor at midnight in a blazing light apartment, and in those 38 days, she'd slept in a locked room on the 12th floor and been driven to work in a car with tinted windows and gone to Vienna with a man who was 600 years old. And the ordinary calendar of how feelings were supposed to develop didn't seem to apply anymore. She'd been living in accelerated time. Everything was compressed and immediate and more real than things usually were. And in that context, 9 days felt less like a limit and more like a measure. She stopped at a bridge over the Danube Canal and stood with her arms on the railing looking at the gray water. She thought about what Murray had said. 9 days, or 9 centuries. Some things you recognize immediately. She thought about what it meant to be recognized by someone truly recognized. The way Alaric looked at her. She described it to herself as being seen, which was accurate but insufficient. He didn't just see her. He valued what he saw. He'd brought her to Vienna as evidence that human perspective mattered, which was the most unusual compliment she'd ever received, and somehow the most meaningful. She walked back to the apartment in the first district as the light went flat and gray over the rooftops. He was back when she arrived, at the window she'd been at that morning, with his own coffee, looking at the city with the expression of someone revisiting something familiar. He turned when she came in. "How was it?" he asked. She came to stand beside him at the window. "Cold," she said. "Beautiful," she looked at the roof lines. "You watched all of this built." "Some of it." He looked at the specific corner of a building across the street. That corner went up in 1873. The street behind it is 300 years older. He looked at her. It becomes strange after a while, watching things outlive other things. "Does it make you sad?" He thought about this genuinely. "Sometimes," he said. "Less so recently." "Why less so recently?" He looked at her. She looked back. The window was between them and the city and the gray afternoon, and it felt like its own kind of frame. "Having someone to show it to makes a difference," he said. He said it plainly, without strategy. She looked at him for a long moment. "Alaric," she said. He waited. She said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to know I'm not saying it because I'm grateful or because I'm displaced from my ordinary life and attaching to what's available. I've thought about it, and I'm clear on what it is." He was very still. "I've felt more like myself in the past 9 days than I have in over a year," she said. "And I think a significant part of that is you. Not what you've done for me, the building and the car, and the security. Who you are. The way you're honest. The way you pay attention." She looked at him directly. "I think you know what I'm saying." He was quiet for a long moment. His expression was doing the layered thing she'd learned, to read the careful management of something that mattered considerably. "I know what you're saying," he said. "I want to be careful with it. Not because I don't," he stopped. "Not because the feeling isn't mutual, but because you've been through something difficult and I don't want to be something you reached for in the middle of it that you reconsider once you're standing on more solid ground." She considered this. "I understand why you're being careful," she said. "I'm asking you not to be. Not about this." He looked at her with those centuries behind his eyes. She held his gaze without flinching. He reached out and very slowly, with the specific care of someone who understood exactly what they were holding, put his hand against her face. "Lena," he said. It came out differently than anything she'd heard from him yet. She leaned into his hand. The city went about itself outside the window. Somewhere below, Vienna was doing what it always did, carrying its centuries without complaint, being beautiful and old and entirely itself. They stayed in Vienna 4 more days. The negotiations concluded in the way careful negotiations concluded, when one party was willing to be fair, and the others were tired enough of the alternative to accept fairness as sufficient. Alaric came back from the final meeting with the specific quality of someone who had managed something complicated well and was ready to stop managing it. She was at the desk in the main room when he came in, working on correspondence that had accumulated during their absence. He set down his coat, looked at her, and she looked up, and they held each other's gaze for a moment, with everything that had been said at the window 2 days ago still present between them, like a room they'd entered together and hadn't left. He sat in the chair across from her desk. She set down her pen. "Tell me something," she said. He settled back. "Anything. What do you actually enjoy? Not what you manage or maintain. What you enjoy." He looked slightly surprised by this, in the way he occasionally looked surprised by her, as though she'd asked something no one had thought to ask in some time. He thought about it genuinely. "Music," he said. "I've always come back to music. There's a particular quality to live performance that hasn't changed across 6 centuries, the unrepeatable nature of it. He looked at her. Books. I read constantly, walking in places I know well at times when no one else is moving through them. He paused. This, actually, he gestured slightly, between them. Conversation with someone who is actually thinking rather than performing thought. She smiled. What did you do for the periods when you didn't have that? Read more books, he said dryly. Reorganized the library several times. Corresponded extensively with people who were also very good at thinking. She laughed. He looked at her when she laughed the way he often did, with an expression that was quiet and specific. The look of someone who had decided a particular thing was worth preserving in memory. There's a concert tonight, he said, if you want to go. She looked at him. Vienna, November. Concert, yes, she said. Obviously. Yes. It was a small venue, 40 people at most, a string quartet in a room that had been built for exactly this purpose in 1889 and had not substantially changed since. They sat in the 3rd row, and the music was extraordinary in the way live music was extraordinary, immediate and mortal, and entirely itself. She was aware of him beside her the whole time. The quality of his attention during the music was different from his other attention, softer, more unguarded, the way people were in the presence of things they loved without reservation. She watched him as much as she watched the performers, watched what music did to the careful management of him, the way it loosened something without his permission. Afterward, they walked along the canal because the night was clear and cold, and she said she wanted to walk, and he fell into step beside her without question. Their breath made white clouds. The canal reflected the lamplight in long orange strips. Tell me about the 1st century, she said. He looked at her. The 1st century of what? Of being what you are. He was quiet for a few steps. Difficult, he said finally. I was changed without consent. By someone who saw what he wanted in me and took it without consideration of what I might have wanted for myself. He said it plainly, carrying it as simple history. It took me a long time to stop being angry about it, longer still to stop being afraid of what I was. How did you stop? He thought about this. Time, partly, and books. He almost smiled, and occasionally a person who looked at what I was without fear and helped me understand it wasn't a verdict. Is that what Elisa was? She'd found the name in a letter weeks ago, filed it, hadn't asked until now. He glanced at her. Yes, he was quiet a moment, among other things. She died in 1954. We were together for 20 years. Was it worth it? He looked at the canal, without question. He looked back at her. What you lose when someone you love dies is not cancelled by the having loved them. It's the permanent record of it. He met her eyes. I don't say that to warn you. I say it because it's true, and you deserve the truth. I know, she said. She looked at the water. I'm not afraid of it. You keep saying that about various things, because it keeps being true. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him on the canal path with the lamplight and the cold and the long reflections in the water. He reached for her hand, held it. She felt the specific quality of the hold, certain and careful all at once, the way you held something you intended to keep. I don't know what this becomes, he said. I want to be honest about that. What I am has implications for what we could be that aren't simple. I know that too, she said. But I know what it is right now. He looked at her, and what it is right now is the most present I've felt in a very long time. She stepped closer to him on the canal path. Good, she said, because I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her with those amber eyes carrying their centuries, and then he kissed her on the canal path in Vienna while the city turned quietly around them, and the water reflected the light and carried it away downstream. And she held on to him with the hands of someone who had stopped asking permission to want what she wanted. They came back to the city in December, and things were different in the way things were different when something true had been acknowledged, not changed exactly, but clarified. The shape of what they were to each other had definition now, clean edges you could see. She moved out of her apartment. Not immediately. It took 3 weeks of logistics, and one very deliberate conversation with a lawyer, and one conversation with the building manager that she had with Alaric beside her, in a way she hadn't asked for, but found she was glad of, and Marcus Webb had looked at the two of them from across the lobby with those pale eyes, and said nothing, and Lena had met his gaze and felt, for the first time in 4 months, nothing that resembled fear. She found an apartment in a different neighborhood, ground floor of a building that was considerably older than it looked, with security that Alaric had arranged, and which she'd examined carefully enough to satisfy herself. It was real. It was hers. She'd chosen it, signed it, paid for it with the salary that was legitimately hers from a job she'd legitimately earned. She stood in the empty main room on the first day and felt the specific weight of a space that was entirely new, carrying none of the residue of the previous 4 months. She brought almost nothing from the old apartment. Started mostly fresh. The bookshelf she built herself over several weekends, which she'd never done before, and found unexpectedly satisfying. The kitchen she stocked deliberately, each item chosen. The desk in the second room she set up for work, the good lamp, the particular organization of pens and paper she'd developed at the office, extended into her private space. Because this was apparently who she was, someone who found structure comforting, who built systems because order was a form of respect for the things that mattered. Alaric came on the 4th evening with wine, and a book he thought she should have, and stood in the hallway of the apartment, looking at what she'd done with it so far, with an expression she'd learned to read as approval, which on him was quiet and specific. "You made it yours very quickly," he said. "I had practice," she said. In Salzburg she stopped. That was someone else's story. She shook her head. "I know how to settle." He looked at her. Where did that sentence start? Nowhere important. "Come see the bookshelf." He came and looked at the bookshelf and said she'd organized it in a way that suggested a particular kind of mind, and she said what kind, and he said the kind that looks at chaos and immediately sees the logic that would make it orderly, and she said that's just pattern recognition, and he said yes. He agreed, and he found it remarkable. They ate at her table. She'd cooked, which she hadn't done properly in months, the kind of cooking that required attention and produced something specific, not survival eating, but actual cooking for pleasure. He watched her do it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she did, and it occurred to her, setting plates on the table in her own new apartment, with the winter pressing against the windows, that she was happy in a way that was clean and real, and not contingent on anything continuing to be okay. That was the difference, she understood. She'd been happy before in ways that felt conditional, dependent on circumstances remaining stable. What she felt now was built on different ground, on herself, on having come through something, and found she was still there. "You're thinking very loudly," Alaric said across the table. She looked at him. "I'm thinking about the difference between happiness that feels stable and happiness that doesn't. And I think this is the stable kind." She looked at him. "Because it's built on things that are actually mine, not on things staying a certain way." He held her gaze. "That's one of the most important things a person can understand," he said. "Have you felt it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not consistently," he said. "It comes and goes across a long life." Right now he met her eyes. Yes. She raised her glass. He raised his. They held each other's gaze across the table in her new apartment, with the wine and the food and the winter outside, and the particular warmth of a space that belonged to the life she was actively building, rather than the one she'd fled. "I have a question," she said. He waited. "The thing you are. Can it be she didn't have the right word? Shared." He was very still. "I'm not asking for myself right now," she said. "I'm asking because I want to understand the landscape of what this is." He set down his glass. Yes, he said. It can be. Not simply, and not without significant conditions. He looked at her steadily. And not without me being completely certain you understand what you'd be agreeing to. What would I be agreeing to? The same thing I didn't get to agree to, he said. Except that I would never take that from you. It would only ever be a choice you made fully, with everything you needed to know already in your hands. She nodded slowly. That's the difference, she said. That's the whole thing, isn't it? Yes, he said. That's the whole thing. She looked at him across the table, reached across and put her hand on his. Not today, she said. But I'm glad I know it exists. He turned his hand over and held hers. I'm glad you asked, he said. January, the city gray and cold and stripped of its December decoration, which Lena had always found she preferred the honest version of winter, without the softening overlay. She'd been working at Corvus Holdings for 2 months. In that time, she'd reorganized the entire administrative infrastructure of a 600-year-old business operation, established a secure digital correspondence system that interfaced correctly with the existing physical one, managed the follow-up from the Vienna negotiations, handled the legal correspondence in 3 languages, and onboarded 2 additional staff that Alaric had decided the operation needed, and which Lena had handled hiring for with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Mrs. Aldrin had watched all of this with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for a specific thing to arrive and was quietly satisfied with its arrival. She'd said to Lena once, in passing, that the position had existed in various forms for 400 years and had never been filled by someone who understood it instinctively. Lena had said what made it instinctive, and Mrs. Aldrin had said you don't think of it as assisting him. You think of it as building something together. Those are different things. Lena had thought about this for several days. She was at her desk on a Thursday afternoon when the building's security desk called to say a man was asking for her in the lobby. No appointment. Sandy hair, pale eyes. She was very still for a moment. Then, she called Alaric's direct line. He answered immediately. She told him in 2 sentences. He said, "Stay at your desk. I'll be down in 2 minutes." He was there in 90 seconds, which told her something about his capacity for speed that she filed without surprise. He went to the elevator. She stayed at her desk as he'd said. 45 seconds later, he was back. "He's gone," Alaric said. He came to stand in front of her desk, looking at her with that focused attention. "Are you all right?" She noticed her hands were flat on the desk surface, pressing down, grounding herself. "Yes," she said. "What did you say to him?" He met her eyes. "I told him that this building and everyone in it was under my protection." He held her gaze. "And I told him what that meant in terms he understood." She looked at him. How did he take that? "He won't come back," Alaric said simply. She believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she'd spent 2 months understanding what Alaric was capable of. And more importantly, understanding his particular quality of certainty, the kind that came from 6 centuries of being exactly what he said he was. He didn't make promises imprecisely. When he said something, it was because it was true. She breathed out. "Thank you," she said. He pulled the chair that lived beside her desk, the one Mrs. Aldrin occasionally used, and sat in it, which he'd never done before, always standing when he spoke to her out here. He sat in it with his arms resting on his knees and looked at her with a directness she recognized as meaning he was about to say something he'd considered carefully. "I want you to know something," he said. She waited. "I was not going to let anything happen to you." He said it quietly. "From the first day. I told you that you were safe here, and I meant it absolutely. But what I want you to understand now is that it's not," he paused, choosing the word. "It's not because of the position you hold here, it's because of you. Because you matter to me, specifically and considerably. And protecting you isn't a function of my role as your employer, it's something I do regardless." She looked at him sitting in the chair beside her desk on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. This 600-year-old creature in his dark suit who had walked into a lobby and with 2 sentences removed the shape of fear that had been reorganizing her life for 4 months. She thought about the job listing at midnight with no company name, about the specific desperation that had sent her here, about Mrs. Aldrin saying you were right to come here. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He held her gaze. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said. "I want you to know that specifically. Not because you handled it. Because I'm not the same person I was when I walked in here 2 months ago. I've rebuilt enough that the fear doesn't have the same hold." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you do it." She looked at him steadily. "You're very good at watching without interfering." "You didn't need interference," he said. "You needed space and safety and a decent filing system." She laughed. He looked at her when she laughed. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she'd said everything important to him directly, without angle, not because the moment demanded it. Because it was true, and she'd decided she was done waiting for the right time to say true things. He looked at her in the chair beside her desk on a Thursday afternoon, with the winter outside the arched windows and the old building around them. "Lena," he said. Just that. "Her name," said the way he said it, with the weight of someone holding something they'd been waiting a long time to hold. "I love you," he said. "I have been for longer than is perhaps reasonable, given the duration of our acquaintance." He looked at her with those centuries behind his eyes. "But I've been alive long enough to know that reasonable has nothing to do with when these things are true." She reached across from her desk and took his hand. They sat like that in the afternoon of the old building, her hand in his, the winter going about itself outside, and she felt in the simple fact of it, his hand, her hand, the truth said aloud between them, something she understood was the ground she'd been trying to find for years. Spring came to the city in the way spring came after difficult winters suddenly, and with the quality of something that had been waiting with great patience to be allowed. Lena stood on the small balcony of her apartment in March with her coffee, and watched the trees in the street below beginning their annual argument against winter, and felt the specific sensation of a person who had lived through a season of genuine difficulty and was standing on the other side of it, still themselves. She'd been at Corvus Holdings for 5 months. In that time she'd built something she was genuinely proud of, not just the administrative systems, though those were excellent, but the actual functioning of what the company did, the way it moved and communicated and managed its considerable and unusual affairs. She understood it now in its full complexity, including the layers that weren't publicly documented, and she managed those with the same precision she brought to everything else. More than that, she'd become part of something. The silver-haired Mrs. Aldrin, who she'd learned had been with Alaric for 60 years and showed no sign of stopping, had developed toward her an affection that expressed itself in coffee, appearing at exactly the right moments, and the occasional remark that managed to be both dry and warm simultaneously. The 2 staff she'd hired were good and getting better under her management. The building, which she'd initially experienced as sanctuary, had become workplace, which was different and better a place she came to because it was hers to run, not because it was the only safe space she could find. Her apartment had become properly home. The bookshelf was full. The kitchen had developed the particular personality of a kitchen that was used regularly and well. She had a plant on the windowsill she talked to, which she'd have found eccentric before, and now found entirely natural. She'd had dinner with her sister, who'd come to visit and had sat across from Lena in a restaurant and said, "You look different." And Lena had said different how. And her sister had said like yourself, but more. Her sister had met Alaric briefly, shaken his hand in the restaurant doorway with the assessing look of an older sister, and later texted Lena a single line. "Okay, I see it." Lena had smiled at her phone for approximately 5 minutes. She thought about all of this on the balcony with her coffee. about the line between where she'd been and where she was, which was real and clear, and not something she intended to minimize. She'd been afraid for 4 months. She'd been diminished by it, restructured around it. She was not pretending that wasn't true. But she'd also sent an email at midnight to a job listing with no company name, and walked through a door on the 12th floor of a stone building in the old financial district, and met something she hadn't known was waiting for her. She heard him before she saw him, the particular quality of the building as he moved through it, the way she'd become attuned to in the months of working and living and loving him. He came to stand beside her on the balcony. He'd brought his own coffee. He stood in the March morning light with his coat and his dark hair and looked at the street below. "You're thinking again," he said. "You say that like it's remarkable," she said. He glanced at her. "When you think this specifically, it is." He looked back at the street. "What are you thinking about?" "The distance between November and March," she said. "What that distance actually contains." He was quiet. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to know I've thought about it carefully, and I'm not asking from fear or urgency. I'm asking because I want to understand what choosing it would look like." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes. "What would it mean?" she said. "If I wanted to stay. Not just in the job and the apartment and this city." She held his gaze. "With you. In the way that you actually stay." The morning was very still around them. The trees below were doing their slow green argument against winter. Somewhere a church bell counted the hour. He looked at her with 6 centuries behind his eyes, and a spring light on his face, and an expression she'd learned to read as the most unguarded version of him, the version that only appeared when something mattered beyond his capacity to manage it. "It would mean a choice you made completely free of me," he said, "informed and deliberate, and yours." He looked at her steadily. "It would mean changes that are significant and permanent. It would mean losing things you currently have." He paused. "And it would mean I would not lose you." He said the last sentence quietly. "It would mean I would not have to watch you age and diminish and leave." After he stopped. After Elisa. He looked at the street. "I told myself I would not need this again, would not want it." He looked back at her. "I was wrong." She looked at him on the balcony in the March morning. "I'm not ready to decide today," she said, "but I'm asking you to know that I'm thinking about it, that it's a real thought, not a hypothetical one." He nodded once. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." She looked at the street below, the trees and the morning and the city going about itself. "Tell me one thing," she said. He waited. "Are you glad I applied for the job?" He looked at her, and the expression on his face in the spring light was the simplest and most complete she'd ever seen from him. Nothing managed. Nothing contained. Just true. "Every day," he said. "Every single day." She made the decision in autumn, not because autumn was symbolic, though it was, and not because a year felt like a meaningful interval, though it did. She made the decision in autumn because she'd spent a year being honest with herself about what she wanted, and had arrived at an answer that was clear and unambiguous and hers, built on ground that was entirely solid. She'd told him on a Saturday evening in October, sitting in the library of the 12th floor that had become as familiar to her as her own apartment's rooms. She'd said, "I'm ready to choose, and I'm choosing this." He'd been very still. Then he'd said, "Are you certain?" And she'd said yes, and he'd said, "Tell me why," and she'd told him. Not because she was afraid of being alone, not because of what Marcus Webb had been, or what those 4 months had cost her. Not from gratitude or displacement, or the particular vulnerability of someone who'd been helped when they needed it, because she'd spent a year rebuilding herself from the ground up, layer by layer, skill by skill, day by day, and from the solid ground of who she actually was, she looked at the life ahead of her, and chose the one that included him. Chose it with full knowledge of what she was setting down, and what she was picking up. Chose it the way she chose everything now deliberately, with her eyes open. He'd listened to all of it. When she finished, he'd said, "Then, yes, that's my answer." Yes, the change happened on a night in late October, when the city smelled of wood smoke and cold leaves, and the particular ancient nests that old cities gave off in autumn. Mrs. Aldrin had been present, which Lena had wanted. The older woman's quiet competence was a specific comfort. The presence of someone who'd witnessed this kind of threshold crossing before and knew it could be navigated. She'd come through it herself. That was what she kept returning to afterward, in the first strange, bright hours of being something other than what she'd been. She'd come through it, and she was still herself. Sharper, more, different in ways she was only beginning to understand, but fundamentally and recognizably, Lena Vasquez, who was organized and perceptive and direct and liked good coffee and built bookshelves on weekends and had sent an email at midnight to a job listing with no company name, and walked through a door on the 12th floor of a stone building and found, waiting there, a life she hadn't known to want. Alaric had sat beside her through the night, watchful and steady, and when she'd opened her eyes with the new sharpness in them, he'd been the first thing she saw. He'd looked at her with that expression she'd come to know as the most unguarded version of him, the one that didn't manage anything. "How do you feel?" he'd asked. "Like myself," she'd said. And like more. He'd smiled then fully. The way she'd learned was rare, and was everything. In the weeks that followed, she learned what being more actually meant. The sharpness of perception that made the city knew every building distinct, every stone specific. The ancient bones of the place visible to her now in a way they hadn't been before. The physical capability that she experienced, not as power in the dramatic sense, but as ease, moving through the world with a fluency that was its own quiet pleasure. The sense of time that had altered, she could feel the length of it ahead differently now, not as an abstract concept, but as a real thing with real weight. She went to see her sister. This had been the conversation she'd prepared for most carefully, not the supernatural facts, which she delivered with a directness she brought to everything, but the emotional reality of what her choices meant for the shape of their relationship going forward. Her sister had been quiet for a long time. Then she'd said, "Are you happy?" And Lena had said yes, genuinely, completely, and her sister had said, "Then I'll figure out the rest." She stood on the 12th floor on an evening in November, 1 year and some weeks after she'd first walked through the door at the end of the corridor, looking at the city through the tall, arched windows. Behind her, she could hear Alaric in his office, the familiar sound of him working, the quality of the building organized around his presence the way it always had been. She thought about the job listing at midnight, the 3 sentences she'd sent into the dark. "I am organized. I am discreet. I am available immediately." She'd been available. She'd been available, and she'd been desperate, and she'd been honest about it. And walking through that door had been the thing that opened everything else. Not because she'd been rescued, she hadn't been. She'd built her own way back to herself with her own hands. But because she'd had somewhere safe to stand while she did it. Someone who paid real attention while she found out who she still was. She heard him come out of the office behind her. She didn't turn. He came to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the city with her. The amber lamplight of the streets below, the old buildings, the particular winter light that came off the sky at dusk in cities that had been cities for a very long time. "She's thinking again," he said. To no one in particular. "She's allowed," she said. He glanced at her with the expression she'd been collecting for a year and intended to collect for considerably longer. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the city. "About how I got here," she said. "About the distance between the woman on platform 9, she stopped." "Wrong story." She shook her head. "About the woman who sat on her floor at midnight with a cracked phone and sent 3 sentences into the dark. And that she was braver than she knew she was." Lena looked at him. And that it worked. He looked back at her. It worked, he agreed. She reached for his hand. He took it with the specific quality of hold she knew now certain and careful, the hold of someone who understood what they were keeping. She looked at the city going about its ancient and ordinary business below them, thought about the years ahead, the long road of them, and felt ready for all of it, in the way she'd learned to feel ready not because she had certainty about outcomes, but because she trusted herself to navigate whatever came. She'd walked into the right building at the right time and been honest about why she was there, and built something real from it. Everything else had followed from that. She had a feeling everything else would continue to. The night deepened around the old city. The windows held them in their frame of light and warmth. And Lena Vasquez, who had once applied for a fake job to escape her stalker and been told by the man who hired her that she wasn't leaving this building tonight, stood in that building a year later and understood that of all the true things that had been said to her in her life, that one had turned out to be the most true of all. She wasn't leaving. She had no intention of ever leaving. She was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was supposed to be.